Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Birth rates are falling. Parents and kids are stressed out. Mental health issues for children are on the rise. Why is it? And how can we change these negative trends? This is what I'm going to talk about today with my guest, Tim Carney. Tim is a senior political columnist at the Washington Examiner. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And today we're going to talk about his new book, Family Unfriendly, How Our Culture Made Raising Kids Much Harder Than It Needs to Be. Welcome to Qualified Opinion, Tim.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So first, I want to start by asking you a little bit about yourself. So tell us about your career and how you got here.
So I've been a journalist in Washington for 25 years. I've been associated with AIER for over a decade. And Vera, you and I worked for many years on what was my primary passion for a decade, which is crony capitalism, corporate welfare, all of that. But I also always liked writing about culture. And just personally, my wife and I, we have 6 kids. We live in the DC area. She's from here. I'm a convert to Catholicism. She's a cradle Catholic. And the cultural trends of the US have always interested me. So 5 years ago, I published a book called Alienated America that was sort of inspired by the widespread belief that the American dream is dead and what exactly that means. And that ended up coming down on, it's about the collapse of community, that people don't belong to as many things. People don't go to church. They don't join their PTA. As Robert Putnam said, they don't join a bowling league. That, I think, is the most important story of the last 60 years in America. The most important story going forward and the most important consequence of the collapse of community, I think, is the shrinking of the American family, the retreat from marriage, the delay in marriage, the increasing number of people not getting married, and the number of people who either aren't getting the number of kids they want, and Gen Z particularly, the growing share of people who say they just don't want children. And so that's what brought me around to write this. And I didn't want to write a book that was just saying, hey, you all need to have a bunch of kids. I didn't think that would be helpful. And so I asked, what is it about our culture that would deter people from having children?
So let's dig in. And so I want to start by asking you, can you actually kind of put some meat about the problem that we are facing right now?
So, and you named them, I would say the 2 real measurable phenomena are childhood anxiety on the rise and the falling birth rate that has been going on for, particularly I focus on the last 15 years. So, the American Journal of Pediatrics declared that there is an epidemic of rising childhood anxiety. All the studies point towards this fact that children are more anxious. Millennials who are, young adults now come out of their childhood more anxious. So that's one problem. And I argue that that's connected to the falling birth rate. So the numbers there. When we had our first child, Lucy, in 2006, there were about 4.3 million babies born that year. It was on the way up. It was called the baby boomlet. Now for 2023, the preliminary numbers show that we're down below 3.6 million. So that's a huge drop from 4.3 to 3.6. It's been going down basically every year for 15, 16 years. Then the birth rate that most people hear the most is called the total fertility rate. That's the number of women, the number of babies per woman. 2.1 is a replacement level. Meaning the population would stay the same if you had no immigration in the long run. We're above 2.1 in 2006 and 2007. We're now down to about 1.6 or 1.7 babies per woman. And so that's about the same as Europe as a whole. There are other countries that have this issue. South Korea, most acutely, is down below 1.0. But in the US, we have a low and falling birth rate for the last 15 years. And that's following a few decades of like a not very low and flat birth rate. going back from 1970 to 2006.
So you start your book. I thought it was kind of interesting. So I'm French, and I really raised my kids with almost no sports, and in large part it's because it's not really in my culture. And as it happens, none of my kids were good at sports. So I was totally fine, them not being, intensely involved in sports. But that's it. I mean, they joined sports, and I was always the one parent who was never going to practice, or was never, or very rarely going to actually games. And I could feel that I was very different. And I thought it was interesting that you open your book with the travel trap, right?
Yep.
And this, to me, is kind of one of the real big expression of the overparenting that exists. It's one in a younger age. It comes. There are other ways it comes out later, but in a younger age. So, can you actually talk to us about what that travel trap is and what it does to family?
Sure. So when I played Little League back in New York, outside of New York City, I would walk or ride my bike to the games. There weren't practices during the season for Little League. You had like preseason practices to get to know everybody, and then you just played games. The coaches were all a dad who volunteered, and my mom and dad barely came to any games. I was lucky that they were at the only games. I hit 2 home runs in my 500 game career of my entire life. I even played as an adult, and 2 of the rare games my parents came to were those games. So they didn't feel they had to be there. And then when I played summer league ball, there was a summer all-star team for the whole town, and you would play the surrounding towns. And a couple parents loved to go to every game. And so we would ride our bikes to the field, and then those couple parents would take us to the game. It never crossed my mind that my mom would drive me to some other state to play in a game. It certainly never crossed my mind that our family's schedule would be dictated by my sports schedule. There's just no way that would have happened. You have no idea how many parents I talk to now who say, I wish that the swim coach wasn't the dictator of my family schedule. But that's part of the travel team trap. So how you fall into it? Well, Katie and I, my wife and I, we fell into it a little bit for our oldest son, Charlie, because he wanted to try out for this select team. We let him try out. We didn't quite know what we were getting into. He made the team, and then they said, okay, winter workouts start. Baseball season, the games start in mid-April. But in January, they were doing indoor workouts for 12-year-olds. And the very first thing the coach said, and this is how the book begins in chapter 1, baseball isn't fun. Winning baseball is fun. This is what he says to a 12-year-old. Which is kind of interesting. Yeah, because you would think that actually playing is what's fun, right? And winning is kind of maybe the cherry on top. But or it's a motivator is how I describe it. Yeah. You're not going to, by the time they're 12, if you say, we're only here to have fun, yada, yada, do what they want, they're not actually going to try hard. But the virtues of sports, A, it's fun. B, they get exercise. C, they struggle. They learn to deal with failure. Hopefully they learn to be gracious in success. They learn teamwork. They learn different personalities. We send our kids to Catholic schools, so these rec teams are a way to sort of broaden their social circles, etc. But no, the coach made it very clear this was about winning. And so parents fall into the travel team trap, and they end up, their family schedule gets dictated by this. The kids have less fun because it's only about winning. It's only about specializing at a particular position. They specialize in a sport. So they quit basketball just to play baseball year round. One woman I know who, a relative of my wife, who escaped from the travel team trap, she said, we just started because they're super active, right? They're not, my family and I, we just kind of sat around yesterday. We didn't do anything. It was a Sunday. That was our idea of a day of rest. This woman, no way. But she started going sea kayaking with her family and hiking and camping. So they didn't give up year-round sports to be lazy. They gave up year-round sports to do family stuff that everybody actually liked more, but it didn't sort of have the markers of success. You can't put on your resume oh, I go camping and backpacking with my mom a lot. And so, but the other thing that happens with the travel sports, is the little leagues either pressure you into the travel sports or they get worse because the good pitchers, the good basketball players, the good whatever stop playing in the rec league. The dads stop coaching, and all of a sudden these local leagues start to disintegrate. So your only choice is to play this. Or I've known JV baseball coaches, junior varsity coaches who have said, if you want to try out for my team, you need to be playing travel ball year round. I don't want to see you goofing off and spending your summer just fishing at the creek. You have to be doing this year round, or I don't think you're taking it seriously. So what's a game becomes a job for 12-year-olds. And it's a headache for parents.
And it's expensive, right?
Yes. The one time we did it, it was like an $800 season in addition to some equipment. Normally for Little League, we're paying $150, which, if you got 4 kids doing it, that adds up, but it's still doable. It's absurd. And they sometimes expect you to buy this. And then you realize that it becomes a bit of a business. And so actually one of the critiques I make is that of our parenting culture is that the logic of capitalism seeps into our social arrangements. I think capitalism is a good economic arrangement. It's different from a social arrangement. A little league run by volunteers, all that isn't about getting ahead, profit, climbing the ladder. It's about the virtues and the fun of sports for youth.
And the thing that you explain really well is the fact that it's not really working, right? It doesn't, this intensity, sport intense investment from parents and from children doesn't actually necessarily produce really great kids,
yes.
or
well-rounded
or
athletes
kids.
or
yes.
happy kids or anything on any way you measure this. So I like to think I can persuade parents not to do this by talking about family culture being more important. Otherwise, you point to the psychiatric impacts that I cite the studies in the book that these kids are more anxious, they're less happy, they're less even satisfied with their own athletic ability than the other kids, in part because they're specializing and they think they should be awesome and they keep climbing the ladder. And then they get to a point where they realize there are 1,000 kids better than them at their one position. And then also one final argument I make is why not to take away hiking and camping and a second or third sport or whatever and spend all this money is you're probably not going to make your kid into a D1 athlete who gets a full scholarship. They're probably not going to go pro. And the way I quote this athletic director, Dan, is telling me, however much you try, some slightly more athletic kid or vastly more athletic, just naturally kid is going to say, hey, you know what? Baseball, that sounds fun. I'll try it. And boom, your son loses his starting job. And one dad said to me when his son quit baseball, 8 years of baseball down the drain. It's like, no, what was this all for some other? Did you have fun?
They see it as an investment as opposed to an investment that doesn't pay off. You know what is interesting? I don't know if you've read the book Range by David Epstein. And I was thinking, because now I'm going to think of you as the guy who's going to try to actually change our culture on parenting. The case actually that Epstein make in this book is like generalist as opposed to the specialist. And that starts with sports are the one who usually end up on top. And the reason is because it leverages our modern brain. And he starts with the fact that he starts with 2 athletes and he doesn't tell your name. So the first one, immediately is like he was playing golf at 3 months old or whatever, or 6 months old, 1 year old, and it's Tiger Woods. And the other one, he played all sorts of everything with a ball he was good at, right? Yeah. His mom was a tennis coach, but because he returned the ball funny, she didn't really quite want him to specialize in tennis, but besides he didn't want to. And then that ends up being Federer. Right. And what the book makes the case in all sorts of disciplines, and it's one of my favorite books. And I think it's kind of a book you need to look at because to make your case that specialization goes actually against a mentality of actually becoming talented. Because those kids who have this kind of wide view, who've kind of actually learned to play tennis and then soccer, and their brain thinks differently and they pick up some things in each sports that actually make them good in the thing that they will specialize into later. And I just I kept thinking of Epstein's book when I was reading I guess the first 20% of your book.
Yeah, the special, and for kids especially. And so, I mean, I have, as I said earlier, sort of specialized at points in my career and had, this is what I'm going to spend most of my time, 90% of my time working on. But I've changed it over my 25 years career, subtly shifted, which is something the New York Times, for instance, does that with reporters. Is they'll put you on a beat. You will be the energy reporter for 10 years or 5 years, and then they'll move you over and you'll be the South Carolina political reporter. And because they know that that's good for you as an adult. It is so much more important as a kid. I quote this music teacher, old friend of ours, Amelia. She's the kind of woman, like, she teaches inner city schools. And so she gets interviewed on like Black History Month. What do you want to, what's your dream for your kids? And one person said, in the DC area, is your dream to see one of your kids being the, name in lights, marquee violin player at the Kennedy Center? And she laughed out loud and she was like, I don't think you understand what I'm doing with my job. She said, let me tell you about one of my favorite alumni. His name is Victor. He was a piano player, piano player in this inner city school. It was either New York or DC. She said, right now he writes me regularly about how he's doing ballroom dancing, about how he's, become a park ranger and is studying geology. She takes credit for the fact that his interests are so expansive. And that's a word she uses, expansive. And I thought that's a word for childhood that we should want, not intensive.
Yeah, it's a good point. What do you think what's the role that the crazy college culture and competition plays into that specialization, into that kid's specialization, or this intense parenting that starts with sports and music? And
certainly we see that a lot of people, not just like a working class couple that doesn't think they can afford college, but everybody doesn't think they can afford college or thinks they can only barely afford it. And then getting into a more elite school, that is a big motivator. Some people will just game it and say, okay, what's the sport that nobody else plays that, UPenn has a team in? Let's put them in women's fencing.
Yeah, it used to be, I remember that women rowing or golf used to be like a way to guarantee,
And in some ways, that's if you're doing that to just game the system, that's its own little problem. But if you're not messing up your kid's childhood, I'm not going to complain about it. But if you think, again, you're going to get a D1 scholarship by spending all your time at your family's life being dictated by swimming, it's a big gamble with something, and the the money you're putting down is your kid's childhood. And so if we were to make a big shift in this culture, I would want it, like, the colleges should do something to help that and change their admissions, change their scholarship, something along that lines to take away, ideally lower their tuition for everybody, but take away that idea that your kid needs to be some super achiever, or they go to community college and they never amount to anything in life. That perception really needs to change. Employers obviously could be part of that. And I don't know. So I guess my question for you, Vera, is like, how is that? Is there this college race in Europe? What do you know about France?
It's different, but I also it's different. So, in France, which is not a good example necessarily, for all sorts of reasons, but France has a much more laid back culture when it comes to parenting, where, and this is what I've always said for my kids, like, I would die for them, but I'm not going to live entirely for them. I remember when my firstborn, when Juliette was born, I remember reading an article. She was very little. She was maybe a week old, in the Washington Post about the empty nester syndrome. And as a French person, I was like, what does that mean? I don't even understand what it means, because you never built your, I can't tell for parents now in France today, but when I was growing up, it wasn't like we had a life. We were more than just parents, even though parents is all consuming. But when it comes to college, it's different. Like in France, for instance, it's our French universities are not renowned for producing a ton of great people, but it's the same as K-12, right? You go where you live.
Yep.
basically. So you have like an automatic spot, and there's just a lot of kids who go to school and then drop out, and then basically, so it's really not a great system, but I assume it's like one where parents are definitely less stressed out than American kids. But that kind of leads me to kind of a question that I had, like, rolling around my head when I was reading the book was, are you talking about a culture of parenting that is really one that only reflects the upper middle class and the upper class? Because when it comes to college, right, it's hard to get into the first top 25 schools. And that's what, like, people around where we live, they think that's where their kids need to go. But the truth of the matter is, like, they don't have to go there. And there's a huge amount of colleges and universities where kids can go without having to go through the grind of doing what it requires.
So to some extent, I would say the pathologies of over-intensive parenting, where every step of childhood is just oriented towards college and career success, that is an upper class and an upper middle class pathology, but the over-intensity is trickling down. Lots of cultural changes do that. And so for the book, AIER helped me run a focus group. And I talked to men who are undecided about whether they want kids, who don't yet have kids. And it was the middle class and working class guys who said, look, the reason I feel I might never be able to have kids is because I don't want to have kids if I can't give them the best of everything. So then, the Department of Agriculture, USDA, comes out with its estimate. It costs $250,000 to raise a kid from 0 to 18 in the average market in the US. And one guy said, well, I don't believe that, because I think that's just giving your kids the bare minimum. I want to give them the best of everything. Great family vacations that will build memory. I want to make sure they have tutors and the best sports. And so I do think that over-intensive parenting is trickling down to the middle class and the working class in a way that really is postponing family formation. But also, I want the French sort of hands-off parenting. That's something a lot of people have said to me since the book came out. It's like, do you remember that article? And I don't remember. It sounds like an Atlantic article, 5-8 years ago, like how to parent French style. And
there was a book. It was called Baby something.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it was more like hands-off. And some mom at a playground was like, your child seems so desperately want your attention. And the mom was like, eventually she'll give up and she'll go back to the playground. And so that was one of the thoughts in my mind. My chapter 2, times I use the term detachment parenting, but just on the way you were talking.
I call it benign neglect.
Benign neglect, yes. I mean, there's a historic term, salutary neglect, from American foreign policy before we had to solve every problem. And so I use the term salutary neglect. But so the way you put it is like, parenting is the most important thing, but it's not everything. Or the way I thought about it is, parents should try to make their family be family-centered rather than kid-centered. It's so easy to get kid-centered, where that is everything, and to forget that adults are individuals. And that's such a disservice to the kid, because then the kid becomes self-centered. And this happens with some of these top athletes. They're doing great things like watching their diet and exercising, but then the whole family revolves around their swim meet. And then even their own pursuit of being good at something is just about the self. It's not team oriented. It's not family oriented. And so that's a way I try to do about it. So when we now have a driver, a 17-year-old, and at first I worried that we were being a little over controlling when we were like, no, you have to get permission from us to, like, if you're going to drive to Alexandria and be there all day on a Saturday. And I thought, no, we're not being over controlling. We're making sure, because now she has a job, which might be driving her little sister somewhere, which might be being at home when the repairman comes. And so we need her, with this great newfound freedom of being able to drive, to make sure that she's using that for the whole family, to turn her naturally. As a kid, you're self-centered, and it's our job as parents to turn that towards the family. And we're obviously laying down our whole lives for the family, but also we're having we're having lots of fun. And our kids see that. They see that our adulthood is fun. They don't think parenthood is just about focusing on the kid. One time somebody asked our kid, do your parents entertain a lot? And I was in earshot and I heard them say, well, they're certainly entertained a lot. And I thought, that's good.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, no, I mean, my kids grew up with me throwing enormous parties all the time. And that was kind of like my, that's just how I was raised. And so it's like I had my daughter Margot just kind of sometimes didn't love that there were that many people. But I was like, I'm not asking you to be overly social. But again, it has to work for all of us. And so I think it's I think it's a good thing. Parents have to be happy too. And then I was going to ask you, like, if your entire life is devoted to the children and to these sports, how do parents fare with one another?
Oh, so I did end up cutting this because I had only a little bit of research and mostly anecdotal reporting. But I did originally write about what I called travel sports divorces. Mm-hmm. And I have one friend whose his kids play baseball. They're good at baseball. And he said their intensive training is I gave them brothers. So it all happens in the backyard. Yeah. And so I have that quote in there where he said, like, you need 10,000 hours to get good at baseball. My kid gets 10,000 hours just playing wiffle ball with his brothers. Okay. Mm-hmm. But then his reason for not doing travel sports was that slightly older dads who said, well, you know what? I think the divorce happened just because I was always at the travel tournament in Delaware every weekend. My wife was at the homestead with the younger kids, or maybe she would take the girls to the travel, and so the drift apart because of the schedule. The family schedule was not dictated by the family, which gets to another comment I got from would-be parents, especially working class guys. And they said, I just don't feel these days you get to be in charge of your family, so I don't want to do it. And I think that meant a lot of different things. It meant some conservative guys afraid of public schools teaching their kids things they didn't believe. It meant a lot of people who sort of really believed in old-fashioned discipline, like spanking or whatever, and saying that, they'd afraid they'd get arrested if they spanked their kid. But to some extent, I think it meant this feeling that you don't have control over your family's schedule and that you're just pulled in every direction. Which certainly we feel that, and we have to fight against it and retake control.
And of course, I mean, you could get arrested just by actually just sending your kids to the park on their own, right?
Oh yeah,
you're talking
and
about
that. So Silver Spring, Maryland, where we used to live, there was a family that was very free range, and free range families who really take that seriously aren't just like open the door and let you go. They usually show their kid, this is a safe way to walk to the park. You don't want to cross that intersection because there's a blind left turn. You have to stay with your younger sibling. And they drive home these basic things that are going to keep the kid safe. And then they let them go. They give them the skills to be free and then give them the freedom, which is the opposite of the intensive parenting, which is don't ever give your kids the skills because you'll always be the helicopter hovering over them. But one of these families in Silver Spring, they got in trouble with the cops. The kids were not allowed to come home for hours because they thought this is an unsafe home if they would let their kids walk a mile to the park. I think the kids were ages 10 and 6. And again, the kids knew what they were doing. It wasn't just they hadn't wandered out of the house alone. They had been told how to do it. And the police were cracking down. Also, there's this one author, Kim Brooks, who wrote a book about leaving her child in a car for approximately 11 minutes while she ran into a store and bought something from a Target. She made sure it wasn't hot. She cracked the windows. She locked the doors. It was a super safe neighborhood. And some other woman or some bystander, instead of saying like, do you need me to run in the store and get something? Or, hey, I can watch your kids. Or a kid's going to be safe in a car for 11 minutes. She calls the cops. Mm-hmm. She took a video and sent it to the police.
And it was like a two years ordeal for her, right?
Oh yeah, it took up her whole life for 2 years. She was training to be a writer. She had an idea of writing something else, but this was the only story. This was her whole life. So she ended up writing a book called Small Animals. And that for me was really, really interesting how she was a super high stress mom. And she has this line, about how she realized that because she college educated husband just really believed in intentional living, and everything should be exquisitely and painstakingly planned, including having a child. And so because of all that choosing that went into that decision, it made raising a kid so much more anxiety inducing for her, because she had to decide are we going to play Mozart for the baby? When are we going to let her nap? Are we going to teach her to play chess? All of these little things. And so in some ways this was a gift, I think, a generation or two ago, that you were just kind of expected. Most people, not everybody, most people get married and then they have kids, and that's what you do. And so it's not as stressful.
Yeah, no. And obviously we're going to talk about how community play into this. And before we talk about how we got there, I want to talk about how the belief in maximum effort parenting has led to an increase in parenting hours compared to previous generation. You have numbers that are crazy in your book.
Yeah, this was one of the things where the numbers were in the middle of the book, and when my editor read it, he blurted out and ran to his wife and showed it to her and insisted I move it up front. So these time use surveys that look at the amount of time you spend each week doing particular things. So for parents, most of your time is spent both, outside of work, your time is spent both parenting and doing something else. So you're cooking and, shouting homework help or chatting with your kid. How much time is spent just on parenting? So for me yesterday, it was teaching my 15-year-old to drive. So that was solo parenting for an hour. Or driving them to something, or sitting down and just doing homework and focusing on that. In 1975, women obviously worked outside of the home a lot less. Their families were bigger, and dads weren't doing very much of that, just parenting. Come 2000, and the numbers haven't really changed for the last 20 years, but so something but changed between 1975 and 2000. Dads doubled the amount of time that they were spent doing just parenting. Women massively increased the amount of work they were doing outside of the home. Family size shrunk, yet women increased by 50% compared to the moms of 1975. Today's women spend 50% more of their week on just parenting, in addition to the small increases in the multitasking parenting. So that smaller families, more paid work, more help from dad, yet more time. So American parents are all just being much more intensive about the parenting.
And what it means also is kids are not on their own ever, really.
There's one mom who said she realized that at age 10, she didn't think her daughter had a single hour outside of adult supervision. It's just wild. And I remember I stopped and I thought, okay, what do my kids have? And then I realized I had no idea where my 9-year-old was. And so I was like, okay, that's good. He is outside of adult supervision, wandering the neighborhood. But the effect for the kids is a lot less self-confidence, a lot fewer skills. And that's, and then psychiatrists think that translates into more adult anxiety.
I assume also they're less curious, right? Because if they're used to being fed everything, like food, you make them food, so they don't really learn how to cook. You tell them.
You say now it's time for this event.
Yeah, and also you just kind of provide literally everything for them. They are very unlikely to go down the rabbit hole of actually try to learn about a particular topic, or how to fix a car, or just because there's a need. So let's talk about how we got there. How did we got? Is there a way to kind of pinpoint when this shift started to happen, or is it just? I assume it's incremental. It happened, and
it's
over
incremental.
Time.
I don't know. I mean, sometimes I think we think some of the harmful things we do now is just because we can, and I don't know if technology arose that made it easier for parents to be this way. A couple of things I would say. One, progressively over the last 70 years, the United States has become more car dependent. The suburbs that I grew up in New York were old suburbs built, 1900-ish, and then built up again between the wars. And so they were walkable. They definitely were built, especially between the wars, for people with cars or driveways, yada, yada. But the idea was sidewalks and walking and humans moving around. The suburbs built after World War II were much more likely to be more car-centric. And so there, again, then you want economies of scale. So instead of every town having a main street, there's, a shopping center that serves 3 towns, et cetera. High schools, state government started to say, again, high economies of scale. Let's have big central regional high schools with about 2,000 kids. That creates efficiencies. And so all of these things eroded local communities. So I would think that's definitely one of the sources, that once a place became more car dependent and less walkable, kids became more parent dependent.
Well, you have a story in the book, and it got me thinking about my own neighborhood because I was thinking, well, I live in Arlington, Virginia, and there's kind of a culture of walking
absolutely.
But it's often accompanied by parents, or like that said, my kids walked to school because they were walkers. I mean, it's a pretty big distance and they all walked together, which was super fun. They never liked when it rained and I was driving them. But I was like thinking about my own neighborhood, and I actually got to realize, because of your book, that while there are a lot of places to walk, there also are always these big roads that are actually really dangerous and close to us. I mean, it was a big fight in the neighborhood to actually get them to put crosswalk. Carling Springs was like this big artery in a small neighborhood where basically it was so dangerous. And then kids, who were walking to school for middle school, they couldn't cross and talk to each other because they're like, literally, there was no place safe for them to cross. And so it kind of got me to actually look at Arlington and realize that even for us, you really see that this is not something that's been, it's been designed like with cars in mind, which I never thought about.
When people ask me what can government do to help make parenting easier, I say the main thing is just build infrastructure for kids to walk and bike around. More crosswalks and narrower streets. I mean, this is going to upset some people who think that the American dream is driving 60 miles an hour from your attached garage to the shopping center, but narrower streets, definitely sidewalks. I mean, in Fairfax County, where I live, Montgomery, Maryland, where I used to live, a lot of places don't have sidewalks, which is just shocking to me. And again, as a New Yorker, there were sidewalks there. There was that Shel Silverstein poem, Where the Sidewalk Ends. To me, that was like this weird mystical joke, because the sidewalk, of course, wouldn't end. It's infinite. But nope, and the sidewalk ends in suburbia. And so that is the number one place that I would say government can make things easier, is by just erring on the side of making it easier for kids to walk and bike around. And a lot of our friends, if they talk about walkability, they tend to be liberals, or they tend to be talking about wanting to walk to their cool, hip cocktail bar, which is fine.
The 15-minute city is it's all about adults. It's not about families and kids.
And so I would say, I use a term in the book, kid walkability, kid bikeability. That makes me happier than I used to have a pub I could walk to. That was great. But the streets I had to cross, I couldn't let my kids cross them until they were 11 or 12 because they were so big, and especially at night.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the other thing, is like our neighborhood is really badly lit. And I just I remember that I was always uneasy when they were coming back at night. And in fact, I remember when they were coming back at night and I was so uneasy about it, I was always wondering, is America getting to me? Or should I actually be worried? It's kind of like when you live between two cultures, you don't know kind of sometimes you don't find your space. So let's talk about how we create an America that's more family friendly. So first, you have a section on businesses that I thought was actually kind of that was really interesting. And you have a quote that I really liked. You said, right after 9/11, corporate America got all patriotic. after George Floyd was killed, corporate America went woke. As millennials and Gen Z are finding parenthood unattainable, there's an obvious opening for big business to weigh into the culture war today. Corporate America needs to go pro-family now. Can you talk about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it ties in with broader ideas about small L liberalism and pluralism and the idea of neutrality. And I was kind of referring to it earlier with talking about the sidewalks. We generally want institutions, especially government, but other institutions, to be neutral on questions, right? We'll complain if a business gets too political. We'll complain if the government is saying this is the right way to live as opposed to this way. But on this question, I sort of let down my my love of neutrality and say, in these times with high childhood anxiety, low and falling birth rates, it's appropriate for a business to say, actually, we are going to support and accommodate family more than other things. In part because accommodating family is really just accommodating human beings. So to have a pro-human bias, there's some people who will object to that, but to have a pro-human bias, I think, is good. And the fact that parenthood, family is not just some hobby. It's not just, so one of the stories I tell is at the Washington Examiner, when I was an editor there was talk about maternity leave and discriminating against pregnant people. Elizabeth Warren had that story. But we had a good, healthy environment of debate there. And so one of the writers said, so I'm not married. I'm never going to have kids. I'm not religious. The Examiner seems to accommodate you dads. It was me and Seth Mandel specifically. And what about the rest of us?
And between the two of you, you have a lot of kids.
A lot of kids. And so I was like, okay, remember when this guy who follows Premier League soccer, Arsenal or whatever his team was, had a big game. And he's like, I'm going to be drinking from the bar at 10 a.m. on a Friday. So we basically give him a pass. And whether they win or lose, he's going to drink a lot. And so we accommodated his team being in the championship game with an afternoon. When somebody adopted a cat and they were supposed to stay with them for 4 days, we gave them a Friday. And Friday is tough because you have to get everything written for the weekend. So to take off an extra Friday is imposing on everybody, but we accommodated it because there's a cat. So we have very small accommodations for these things that are of lesser importance. And we have bigger, ongoing, daily, explicitly written accommodations for family. And so we're not being neutral on that question. And there's some employers that tried to be feminist by giving maternity leave and then got objection from the people who didn't want to have kids. And so then they started offering doggy leave and doing these absurd things. And I say, no, just be open about it.
So, I mean, on the family leave front, there's a big debate, obviously, about whether government should kind of mandate that firms offer it or not. And Rachel Grasler and I have worked a lot on these issues. And one of the things that she's pointed out in her work is that the measurement about how many companies give leave is very underestimates really how much corporations actually really give leave, because the BLS number only measures the company that provide family leave through a paid leave program, as opposed to all sorts of different arrangement or also temporary disability insurance, right? When you take under consideration all the different forms that employers give, you see that there's actually a lot of employees that have leaves. But the most important part actually about her work is when that is exactly what she said, which was actually there just a lot of negotiating that happens of the book between employers and employees to accommodate families. Mm-hmm. Above and beyond having things on the book. And ultimately, that's really what matters. Relationships is what matters. And if you've been working at a place and you're a good worker, there's a real cost for that employee to actually lose you. Besides, he probably really likes you. And there's just a lot of these informal arrangements that are made. And that's kind of really what we need to really encourage, and the fear is that government top-down policy on that front would actually mean that there's none of these flexible arrangements.
It takes away options, in part because it could be discrimination. It's funny,
exactly.
like you're supposed. And so I think about the example I give in the book is I call it a new mom or a new dad job. And again, I've been involved in this where somebody's let's say they're a Capitol Hill reporter, and she says, "Well, I'm getting married, and we want to have kids right away." Well, Capitol Hill reporter isn't the best job for someone who's 9 months pregnant. It's certainly not the best job for someone who wants to spend time with their little baby. And so you make her into the contributors editor, a job that you can do from home. You rarely have to come in. And if you don't get back to somebody for 12 hours, it's fine. And so that's a sort of, and then from a totally different perspective, I think about my friends who are nurses. They have the ability to dial up and dial down the amount of hours they work at will. Most people don't have that, right? But they can say, okay, I'm going to move to a hospital. I'm going to work 60 hours a week this summer because my husband's a school teacher and he can take care of the kids. And then in September, boom, I'm going back down to 10 hours a week of home visits. And if I have a new baby, I'm going to take off for 6 months. But nurses can always enter and exit because the demand for them is so high. So there are certain jobs that lend themselves to this. I always think of editors as like if you're a grammar ninja. The woman I hired to edit the first half of my book, she became pregnant with her third while editing the book. And so it really was a perfect job for her. If I said, "When can you talk?" She said, "How about this? If all the kids are asleep at any time in the next few days and I'm not napping, I will call you." Like that. That's an accommodation that she's doing freelance, but employers should explicitly make that sort of accommodation. And the more that it's informal and personal, the better it works. And strict top-down government policies or massive corporate policies, because they have to worry about being totally equitable, often they can't take into account the details of different people's lives.
And the other thing is, like, not all parents need the same thing, right? I mean, It's just like there's not a one size fit all about what kind of parents are looking for and how they want to parent. And
Katie did not want me around when there were newborns. Well, my job was to take care of the older kids. Yeah, I took care of the older kids when we had later ones. But with number one, she was like, "Tim, you're talking too much."
Go back to work. So, I mean, I think there is a risk, right, of the government meddling too much with how business cater to parents, and that kind of risk actually discouraging these type of interpersonal arrangement that really exists. There's an incredible network, actually, of arrangement that companies put in place for their workers. And so, what are the other things that government where government gets in the way?
Well, I was totally undecided ahead of time on government support for childcare, in part because it is very clear that, if you have a single poor mom, for her to get a job will be good for her family, and some support and she will need childcare for that. But broad-based universal childcare that they tried in Northern Europe specifically, and in places in the US, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It can, again, for poor single moms, it can be very helpful. But in general, it discourages marriage. It doesn't really increase women's career attainment. It could theoretically increase the GDP a little bit. Experiments in Quebec suggested that. It certainly doesn't help women. So if our birth rate is 1.7 in the US, still 2.7 is the ideal number of children. It doesn't help women get more children either. It ends up subsidizing work. So childcare subsidies subsidize work. And they change the culture to be more careerist, more workist, and less familial minded. So that's one big thing. If a government wants to spend money, in some cases it should increase the child tax credit allowance, but not too big, because if it's too big, again, it discourages marriage. So in my first draft of the book, I actually had the term pronatal a lot. And then I realized I want to be more emphasize that I'm pro-family, because at times those can be different. If it's something that helps people have more babies, but then not spend any time with their kids, then that's not going to be pro-family. So I would say when I talk about that, like taxes, federal support for parenting, for family, I mostly say a tax credit, kind of like what we have now in the US and slightly bigger. I wrote this Wall Street Journal op-ed a month or so ago. $2,000 to $2,400 a year for a kid up until they're about 18 or graduate high school. And that's a basic fairness measure. That's not really a subsidy. It's a tax code acknowledging that children are humans. It equalizes the treatment of a family of five with five individual guys who are all living together and making the same amount of money. But in general, the sort of big spending programs that a lot of these European countries do, some of them seem to have done nothing as far as helping people have more babies. And some of them seem to have been counterproductive.
Yeah, so that's kind of like what I was going to ask you. It's like, and it goes back to that word culture, right? So that trend in decline in fertility actually happens everywhere. Even the French, who used to be actually pretty ahead of the game, now they have like I looked at the recent number, it was 1.8 in France, which is a dramatic drop from where it was when France was held as a model. The decline in fertility has started since after the Second World War, right? And so to me, it's kind of hard to kind of see how any of these different models, I mean, different governments do different things. There's a lot of evidence that big government programs, big pro-family government program can actually backfire in all sorts of ways. But it's also, the most important point is like you have all these different governments, all these different cultures, and yet the trend everywhere seems to be a decline. So how do we reconcile all of this?
So first of all, I think there are different anti-family forces in different cultures. In Northern Europe, and to a lesser extent in the US, I think workism, careerism really do crowd out family. In Southern Europe, I would, because again, France is still, I think it still has the highest fertility rate in all of Europe. It definitely, when it was at 1.9 a year ago,
it's 1.8 now.
Yes, and that I think still would put them at number one. In Southern Europe, along the Mediterranean, there's a failure to launch problem. The men launching their careers later, women catching up on and probably moving past on education, but men not becoming the sort of men who can lead a family because they want to stay at home for mama's cooking. And it's just sort of the welfare states in places like Greece that have really sapped a work ethic. So it's too much workism in the north, too little work value and adulthood in the south. Asia's is very complicated. I've tried to study that, but I haven't been there, so I won't comment too much on it. But the theme that runs through all of them, and this is where the book ends, it's what I call a sadness, a civilizational sadness. The one point of, think of how many young people now say climate. Oh, climate change.
I was going to ask you, yeah.
And you get people saying, I'm not going to have kids because I might end up, if I have a white boy, then he'll grow up to be a white man, and the last thing America needs is more white men. That's sort of like that, the idea that we're bad, that humans were a mistake. But the sadness manifests itself again in just sort of not aspiring to an adulthood and a family, not having hope for the future. I think that is the persistent thread.
Yeah. So where does climate fit into this? Because kids are freaked out from the moment they're in
second
school.
grade.
You have a quote in your book by William Burley from 1990. It reads, "No problem facing the earth looms larger than the growth of the reproductive rate of the human species. Basically, virtually all human suffering can be attributed to the crushing effect of a population that is too numerous for our planet." I mean, our kids have been growing up.
And he was a school principal, and the point of that op-ed was to say this should be taught to kids. He was an elementary school principal, and he was saying they should be being taught this since first grade. And so those were the millennials he was teaching then, and it seems to have, I think, sunk in. And so I cite Ezra Klein in the book, who's like, so if you're saying I don't want to have kids in a planet that's on fire because my kid's life will be horrible, you're kind of full of it. If you live in Europe or the US, like, we will adapt. We will be fine. So he said, I think that the climate fears, when people talk about kids, are really a climate guilt, that they feel like they've ruined the planet. And so I argue that climate guilt is kind of just a totem for a deeper guilt, a deeper lack of belief in human goodness. And I point to the baby boom in the US as an example. It wasn't like a makeup for the babies that didn't happen in World War II. It was massive. It was many times bigger than that. It went on for a generation. And I argue that it's because our men got off the boat, just having defeated 2 evil empires, basically saved the world. And the women were on the dock, just having kept the greatest economy in history running for 4 years. And so they smooched on the pier, went to the chapel, got married, and had a bunch of babies. In part because they never before or since has it been so clear to us that we were good. Germany didn't get a baby boom in the 90s. They had the opposite. They led the way in the collapse. So that idea of we're not good, that matters.
So I think kind of maybe where you and I will disagree more is on the role that the government can play. And I actually really just think that the global trend towards lower fertility rate show that kind of government can slow down the rate with more cash but I also actually really worry about the fact that what it does is it disincentivizes marriage and it disincentivizes work. Not that I actually think women should be working, but the problem is, like, if you have more single women that on top of that they don't work, you just have you accumulate.
That's what intergenerational poverty is growing up without an example of a working parent and then not working yourself.
So I mean, this is why, like, all around, like, right, even forgetting like the problem I have with the child tax credit as a matter of principle and as a way to interfere with actually good tax policy. One of the things that I worry about is, like, if it were just a child tax credit, that'd be one thing, right? And we can, I could live with this, but it's child tax credit on top of the earned income tax credit, on top of this, on top of SNAP, on top of all of this. And this starts to accumulate, not to mention on the spending side, which I actually think that big government is probably something that is understudied as a source of lower fertility. But
Social Security does drive down birth
exactly,
rate. Yes.
Absolutely. But also because it creates all these bad incentives. And so in the end, it always boils down to this for me, which is people who are calling for more government. And this is not what you're doing. In fact, I thought your book was very subtle this way, where it was actually presenting a lot of creative ways absolutely outside of government to solve some of that problem. It's what is hard is persuading people to change our culture, really persuading it. First, where government can play a role is be neutral towards working versus not working for parents, for married parents, right? And you make the case in the book that there's a lot of what the government does by subsidizing childcare and all this that is actually trying to push parents into working. You have like kind of numbers in there about how polls about how on the left people actually really think that it is a good thing to have fewer kids, like the quality versus quantity thing. But it's also that it's better to have a career than having grandchildren. That's crazy to me. But so the persuasion is the hard part, and how are you gonna? I mean, I know you wrote this book, so it's unfair to tell you. So how are you going to pursue this mission of getting more people to have children and to focus on their family in a healthy way?
So part of it is just returning it to it kind of being a norm. Not to say you're a weirdo if you don't want to do it. As a Catholic, I obviously believe lots of people are not called to marriage and parenthood. We priests, nuns, all sorts of religious life are people who are dedicated to a life that's not married. But that if it's sort of the norm, and then to make it look fun, specifically, I would want to be more encouraging of young men to see that being a dad is awesome. And I post on Twitter videos of me like destroying my sons in basketball. Even the one who's taller than me, I still beat him. In part just to say like, this is fun. This is a blast. And so in putting forward positive, realistic visions of parenting, not the TikTok videos of the mom who makes from scratch grilled cheese sandwiches for lunch while being a model. That doesn't help anybody. Mm-hmm. Not the parenting is just hell videos. Those don't help anybody. But fun, positive, realistic vision. But just more and more institutions saying this is a norm and this is a priority. Because I've mostly worked in conservative spaces, I have had a series of bosses who have all made it very clear that family was more important. Editor Steve Smith, editor Hugo Gurdon, Yuval Levin, Robert Dorr, Arthur Brooks at AIER, all these people have made it clear, like, dad is central to their identity. It's more important for them. They show that with their actions, and they show that with how they treat their employees. And so institutions are always going to be central to this. Again, I think everybody in the world should buy my book and then buy a copy for their friends. But it's going to be employers. To some extent, government just saying, like if I were on a city council, I would say, yes, we're going to chop down some of your cherry trees to build sidewalks because kids are more important than trees. Yeah, we're going to lower the speed limit for the kids because kids are more important than cars. The more little things like that get done and it's just set as a norm, this is what we're going to build ourselves around as the next generation. I think that's how you shift the culture. It's not going to be massive piles of money or anything like that. It's going to be doing the policies that tilt things a little more family-friendly way and stating this is our guide star.
And it also kind of requires that people change their mindset about rather than moving away from home, right? Mm-hmm. Like actually staying in their community where it does take a village. I mean, yes. Like it's easier, like rather than subsidizing childcare, right? Having a lot of people watching around is just actually, it's a plus. So there's this cultural shift that needs to happen too, of actually understanding that, the multi-generation family is actually a good thing. And I really never thought about this when I moved out of France, away from my family, right? I just didn't think about the consequences of what it was like to raise these children alone, so far from my family. The thing is, I am so social that I've rebuilt a family here where I have a lot of really close friends and yep. we've raised our kids like this. But I really have felt kind of just how much I lost I will never regret coming to America. I will always regret having moved away from my family because I didn't realize how important it was.
Yep. No, it's very easy to, and in Israel, which has approximately 3.0 birth rate, something like 70% of moms get help from their own mother in raising their kids. It's 35% in Europe. It's probably about the same in the US. And it's so underappreciated how valuable it is. When Katie and when we moved from Maryland to Virginia, we moved only like 30 minutes, but it was just to be 8 minutes away from grandma instead of 45 minutes away from grandma. And the value of that has been incredible for us, for our kids, and for grandma. Yeah. Not that my mother-in-law has a shortage of grandchildren, but adding a few to her, the people she gets to see multiple times a week is big. But in sort of DC, New York, media circles, think tank circles, you'll encounter a lot of people who think that getting away from their parents physically, culturally, etc., that's real growing up. That's achievement. Because again, we were talking earlier, you want your kids to be independent, but if that means moving out of your hometown and getting to the big city, it can make it a lot tougher when you're raising kids because you don't appreciate how valuable family is. One of the ways I put it is family are the people you will always feel okay asking them to help, in part because you know that they'll feel okay saying no if they can't do it. Well, with a friend, sometimes Katie's like, oh, I just don't want to ask her because then she'll feel she has to say yes. Mm-hmm. With her sister, she'll always ask.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously I could keep talking with you for hours about this. There's just so much we haven't covered about like how pregnancy, is contagious. You have a really great chapter on this, which is great. And, we could have talked about why the mini baby boomlet didn't materialize. I mean, there's so much. So I will really encourage people to read your book, but I have a last question for you. What is the mistaken claim that people make about family and how to raise family that you'd like to correct?
I mean, so I'll answer it sort of from a parenting perspective and from a policy perspective, or a macro perspective. The most common answer for why aren't millennials and Gen Z having kids is they simply can't afford it. But the fact is that most measures of affordability and wealth, the current generation, it's not poorer, and parenthood is not less affordable. And so that's not an adequate answer. That does not explain the reduction in the birth rates over the last 15 years or the rise in childhood anxiety. The personal level, I think that because when people think, okay, so parenting, it's going to be the most important thing I do, they think, so then it has to be everything. It has to take up my whole life. Mm-hmm. And they forget, as you were saying earlier, that it's a disservice to the kids if the parents aren't also having fun. But again, more importantly, it's a disservice to the kids if they think the world revolves around them. And so showing your kids you always love them no matter what, forever, and they have to chip into the family, that's ultimately what we're trying to do with a lot of the parenting, is teaching them to be good members of a community, starting with this small little community that all lives in one house. And so thinking, yes, I will lay down my life for my kids, but no, I won't become like the floor mat that they walk on. That's a confusion that a lot of parents have trouble with.
Well, unfortunately, we have to end it here. But thanks so much, Tim, and good luck for your battle
Thank you.
To make America family friendly.
Thank you very much.